it is really just such a great personal pleasure and an honor to introduce Professor Juliet Schor, who is the occupant of the 2022-23 Wayne Morse Chair of Law and Politics. Juliet Schor is an economist and professor of sociology at Boston College, where she has taught since 2001. Before that, she taught at Harvard University for 17 years, and in 2014-15, she was the Martina Horner Distinguished Visiting Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. She's the recipient of many awards, and I'm only going to mention a few because you came here to listen to her, not me. But her awards include the Guggenheim Fellowship, the American Sociological Association Public Understanding of Sociology Award, that was in 2014, the Management and Workplace Culture Book of the Year from the Porchlight Business Books Awards. That's for her most recent book titled After the Gig, How the Sharing Economy Got Hijacked and How to Win It Back. That was published in 2020. There are too many more to mention, but I have to mention my favorite. She is the recipient of the George Orwell Award for Distinguished Contribution to Honesty and Clarity in Public Language from the National Council of Teachers of English. Those English teachers. Juliet Schor is well known for her visionary work on how labor and consumption can be reimagined so that working and spending are both more humane experiences and also foundations for socially and environmentally sustainable economies rather than engines of inequality and carbon emissions. Her first two books were the national bestseller, The Overworked American, The Unexpected Decline of Leisure, and The Overspent American, Why We Want What We Don't Need. She was a member of the MacArthur Foundation Connected Learning Research Network from 2010 through 2017, and it was, I believe, through that experience that she conducted the series of case studies of sharing platforms and their participants that she and her co-authors describe in After the Gig. She has contributed to the research literature as well as written for the public. She has published in many academic journals, as well as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, and People magazine. She has appeared on 60 Minutes, The Today Show, Good Morning America, The Early Show on CBS, and many others. And as if that weren't enough, she is a co-founder of the Center for a New American Dream, which is a national sustainability organization where she served on the board for more than 15 years. And she is currently the vice chair of the board of the Better Future Project, one of the country's most successful climate activism organizations. She is also a co-founder of South End Press and the Center for Popular Economics. Please join me in welcoming Juliet Schor to U of O and Oregon. Oh yes, we have to turn this on. There's a little button.
One minute. We're getting the mic set here.
Should have done this before. Where is it? I think it's this. Maybe. It's just a little button. Oh, maybe I'm missing it. This one?
No.
Okay.
Let's see if it's inside.
Yes, right. Slide that down. Should have done this before. So much for my smooth operation. We appreciate your patience.
No, Ellen was just talking about those TV shows, which I'd forgotten about, but yesterday I heard from Fox News asking me to go on Neil Cavuto, and I sent an email to my family, and they all wrote back and saying, "You wouldn't dare." And of course I wouldn't, because when I went on his show years ago, he was really a jerk. So, and he's only gotten much worse since then. All right, how is the mic? Can you hear it? Okay, great. Thank you. Well, it's a wonderful pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Eugene. Really excited. Thank you to Ellen and the Morse Center It's been really fabulous, and it's great to have actually live people in a room and give a live talk. And a shout out also to all of you on the live stream. It's wonderful that you're here. And I'm going to just dive right in because it's a little on the long side, the talk. Okay. So, in 2013, my research team interviewed Devin, a self-described Jamaican, meaning a Jamaican American, from a diverse inner suburb of Chicago, an enthusiastic participant in what was then called the sharing economy. Devin was on a break from his regular job, which was as a tour manager for global brands such as Nike and PlayStation, and he was earning money on an errand site called TaskRabbit, where he was the #1 rabbit rated in Chicago. He was also hosting on Airbnb. He was offering a free couch on Couchsurfing, and he was renting through Zipcar. Devin loved the freedom to control his own schedule and not have a boss, and he believed these apps were the pathway to a new, more humane economy. Things are going full circle, he explained. In the beginning, we used to do everything for ourselves, and we were very hospitable towards each other. And then corporations started moving in, and everyone went there. And now, due to corruption, people started being anti-corporation. People are going back to helping each other again because it's easier, especially with the advent of the internet. And notice, he thought of all these sharing platforms as something different from corporations. Devin's attitude was common in the early days of the sharing economy. Our informants thought the apps were a route to social change, an alternative to big soulless corporations, and a more moral way to organize the economy. They believed in what my team and I called the Idealist discourse, a rhetoric which framed platforms as bringing economic, social, and environmental benefits. Economic benefits included using idle assets more intensively, such as renting or loaning out a spare room, an empty vehicle, tool, or other household item. This was supposed to yield environmental benefits by reducing the demand for hotels, new vehicles, and consumer goods. Other economic benefits were extra money, especially for a middle class with stagnant incomes. And as Devin stressed, this new way to earn came without the hassles of ordinary employment. No boss, no schedule to adhere to, pure freedom. There were social benefits too. Airbnb hosts and guests would spend time together in cultural exchange. A ride in a Lyft, originally called ride sharing, began with a fist bump, the passenger in the front seat, and a nearly obligatory conversation. Loaning or renting goods in the neighborhood would help people to meet each other and form community. And these apps were also supposed to provide access because renting was cheaper than owning and because they offered opportunity to less privileged people. The apps were also supposed to end racial discrimination. Uber promised an end to blacks' inability to get taxis, to stop or drive into certain neighborhoods. Scholars argued that ratings and reputational information would eliminate what's called statistical discrimination and benefit BIPOC hosts or earners with good ratings. And the companies use this idealist discourse, economic, social, and environmental claims to promote their point of view. When I did the first national polling on some of these issues, Americans seemed to agree with most of the idealist discourse. They believed that they had a better environmental impact, that they would save money, and that it would build relationships. So all the aspects of the idealist discourse were bought by the American public. And this was the first, by the way, random sample polling that was done on the sharing economy. This was all made possible by new digital tools, search and matching algorithms to gather and filter options and make person-to-person exchange more efficient. Crowdsourcing of ratings and reputation to weed out bad actors and maintain quality. Mapping software for driving and delivery. The sharing economy was built on solving the challenges of what I've called stranger sharing and making person-to-person exchange safer and more efficient. Fast forward a decade. So I filmed these myself. This is the day that these Airbnb ads went up in New York City. They were graffitiized by, people who were already very opposed to them. Nearly all the assumptions and predictions of the idealist discourse lie in tatters. The environmental claims were the most suspect from the beginning. Rather than reduce emissions and environmental impacts, Airbnb, Uber, and Lyft have increased the footprints of these services. Ride-hail increases new car registrations, vehicle miles traveled, congestion, and it undermines public transit ridership. The sharing activities that might have reduced carbon impacts, such as loaning or renting tools and household goods, fizzled out almost right away. And I have another project that I don't have time to talk about tonight, but it's on Airbnb and the increased carbon footprints associated with Airbnb. According to this polling that I showed you a minute ago, only Americans are actually not all that interested in sharing things with other people. Only 1 in 3 would like to share more things like tools and household items. So that one really didn't make a lot of sense from the beginning. What about the social benefits? While there is some increased sociability with Airbnb, many of these services quickly reverted to arm's length perfunctory transactions. Lyft and its friendly fist bump faded fast. Eventually, Uber introduced the, quote, shut up and drive button on its app, so passengers who no longer sit in the front can tell the driver they'd prefer not to talk. Research by my team and others has found evidence of continuing racial discrimination on Airbnb against both hosts and guests. Now, what about the impacts on labor? The companies promised a new way to work, no boss, scheduling freedom, become a micro-entrepreneur, and good pay on top of it. While the idealist discourse depicted a happy worker with a lucrative side hustle, a decade later, the newspapers were full of stories of Uber drivers sleeping in their cars. Scheduling freedom was replaced by endless hours of driving just to make ends meet. Workers faced unfair termination, deactivation is what it's called in app lingo, with no appeals or even justification. When the pandemic hit, the companies failed to protect workers with PPE, grudgingly offered sick pay, but with conditions so onerous few met them, and turned to the government to bail them out. So what happened? How did we go from sharing to exploiting? Was the idealist discourse always what's called share washing, the equivalent of greenwashing? A fig leaf to hide predatory behavior, as some contend? Did things start out well but take an exploitative turn as the companies tried to grow rapidly under difficult market conditions? Now, before I get to answers to those questions, let me tell you a little bit about the research I conducted and some of the unique aspects of the gig economy that we discovered. We began in 2011, first studying small, non-commercial efforts to create new forms of exchange, time banks, food swaps, maker spaces. But within a year, the for-profit apps were scaling so rapidly that we turned our attention to them. With a team of 7 graduate students and a couple more who sort of were on the margins, which was funded by the MacArthur Foundation, we began interviewing users of commercial platforms like Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, etc. Since 2009, I've been collaborating with engineers and sociologists on an NSF-funded program called the Algorithmic Workplace, studying additional platforms. And these include Instacart, DoorDash, Care.com, which is the Uber of caring labor, Amazon Flex and Prime, and a small delivery platform we call Bring Your Package. And they're all here. There are a total of 16 platforms. Olio is a food sharing app, but 16 platforms that we've looked at. And one of the points I make in the book is we come to some different points of view than much of the literature because we have a multi-platform study. So we can think about platforms across a whole range of them. Many of the studies have just been done on Uber or just on food delivery. We've pursued multiple research strategies. We've done about 400 interviews across these two projects with workers. We've analyzed big data on Airbnb. Bring Your Package, and I shouldn't be telling you its real name, but here it is. It was called Deliv. Bring Your Package we gave us their data. One of my collaborators, engineer collaborators, actually wrote their algorithm for them. We've scraped data from Uber People, which is the largest online forum for gig workers, to look at strike activity resistance and how workers are using these digital forums. And I personally have had informal access to a lot of founders and key people in the platform ecosystem, in part because I was one of the first researchers studying it and they started seeking me out. We've written, my collaborators and I have written more than 30 journal articles, chapters, in books and other pieces of writing, and the book that Ellen mentioned, After the Gig. So, back to the question. How did things go from great to awful in such a short space of time, and what, if anything, can be done about it? To understand what happened, we need to look at the particularities of the platform labor force and how it created a new kind of, the platform work and how it created a new kind of labor force. So this evening, I'm going to focus on the work and labor side of this because of the theme of the center. And I'm also going to focus on the largest platforms, Uber, Lyft, driving and delivery. So DoorDash, Instacart, Uber, Lyft. They have the biggest labor forces, and they're also the ones with the most problematic practices. These are well-known apps with a common structure and market positioning. The skills required to work on these apps are quite general among the population, meaning lots of people can drive, can go to a grocery store, and deliver items, which means that workers face a lot of competition from each other, and the companies have a relatively large labor pool to pull from. On all of the driving and delivery apps, workers are engaged as independent contractors with none of the rights of employees. No minimum wage, unemployment or accident protection, no health insurance, no right to non-discrimination or non-harassment. Mitch, who was combining Lyft, Postmates, and DoorDash as he tried to build an audio engineering business on the side. And this was something that we found fairly commonly among workers that we talked to. They had side activities that they were engaged in, and the platform work was enabled them to earn money while they were trying to build a business or learn a skill or do something else. Is it fair to me, he asks, to have to own, pay for, maintain my own car, gas, insurance, parking, cleaning, dealing with the smell of food? Clearly, he did not think it was. Independent contractor status also lets the company off the hook for its share of contributions to Social Security, unemployment, and workers' comp. The companies have also outsourced quality control and human resource functions onto consumers through the rating systems. Other features of the app include open access, meaning just about anyone can join with minimal screening requirements. It's pretty much just a criminal record that could keep you off some of these apps, and depending on the app, the level of criminal record varies. They allow what's called multi-homing, which means workers can shift back and forth across apps. And the fact that workers and not the company choose scheduling and the number of hours of work. And this will turn out to be very important in our analysis. In the early days, the platforms were pretty great. They offered high wages for work with generalized skills, and I'm going to call it that rather than what the standard terminology is unskilled work, and that's not an accurate way to describe what these people are doing. They do have skills. It's just that these are skills that lots of people have. So generalized skills. Conditions were good. Workers often express that the company has our back. But that began to change as the platforms began to reduce earnings. Danny, a ride-hail driver, explained, "It used to be 20 hours could get you $800. Now that same might get you maybe $400. The rates were $2.75 a mile. Now it's $1.25 a mile. And I checked a few days ago on websites that give rates. Uber is now paying 80 cents a mile. Between 2014 and 2018, drivers suffered a 53% collapse in their monthly earnings, according to data from JP Morgan Chase, which looks at bank accounts and they see where these earnings are coming in from. So it's the most accurate data that we have. From monthly averages of about $1,500 a month to just under $800, $783. Of course, during the pandemic, the ride-hail market collapsed. The companies have lured drivers back with incentives, but gas prices and another round of squeezing workers from the companies has put them back into a losing game. Drivers we interviewed more recently report working full-time and that once they calculate depreciation and other expenses, admittedly at IRS rates, which are a little bit high depending on the car that you have, but they're reporting making, basically nothing, $7,000 a year after accounting for those for all those expenses. One reason for low hourly rates is that idling time, which the apps were supposed to reduce by their superior efficiency, meaning you're trying to get a ride and you're just sitting around waiting for a passenger, idling time has risen to nearly 30% of work time in some places. There are too many drivers chasing too few passengers. Now, another problem with the apps is lack of transparency. Many workers don't know how much they're making. They pay attention to gross receipts for an evening or a week, but they don't track their time carefully, and many don't have a great way of figuring out expenses. The companies are constantly changing things, so it's very hard for workers to figure out the best strategies for earning. One person we interviewed, he was a food delivery courier. We asked him, how much do you make per hour? Many of these workers can't tell you. I really haven't done a calculation to see how much I've made per hour, he said. I just checked last night, and I made like $500, $505 in the past 3 or 4 weeks, working for 4 to 6 hours. So if we say 4 times 5 is 20, times 4 is 80, so 80 hours, 500, $625. That was the first time he'd calculated that he was making far below the minimum wage. Last week, the New York Times had a story about Para, an app developed by a former Uber employee that helps workers figure this all out. Go figure. The companies are taking legal action to try and stop it from operating. So why have the companies been squeezing workers so hard? Why have conditions deteriorated so much? Well, we can give a simple answer, is that they can, or that's what companies do. And that's true to a certain extent, but there's much more to the story. Many companies offer good wages, benefits, and working conditions. Platforms claimed superior efficiency in the fields that they are in. If that were true, they should be model employers. But of course they're not. The better answer is that there is not a viable business model for what the companies have been trying to achieve. And I think this is the wrong slide here. All right, hold on a second. I'm going to stay with this one. Many scholars point to the role of venture capital. It's well known that for tech companies, VCs want early growth rather than profits, so they pump in lots of money so the company can expand. And this, of course, is what happened with all of these platforms. One of our respondents, who was a delivery courier on a platform called Favor, no longer operating, had been a startup entrepreneur herself, so she knew what was going on. Favor is not a real company, she says. They just have a bunch of investment money. Are they making a profit? No way, it's a bubble. She felt that the pricing structure on the app had the wrong mix between the delivery fee, the tipping, and the volume, as well as unsustainably low wages for couriers. Money from angel investors, she said, it's just not going to make you a business if you're relying on millions and millions of dollars in funding to do something that we can do with $200, by which she meant that couriers buying bikes for $200 and organizing the work themselves. It's all going to go down the toilet, she said. And of course, for many platforms, it did. And here we go. This is just something that just came out today, but it's what happened to share prices on IPOs of all of these companies. Airbnb, which you all know what that is, Fiverr, which is a online freelancing. They're the only two whose share prices haven't declined. Look at Uber. I'm going to talk more about Uber. A 39% decline, Lyft an 82%. You haven't heard of Rover was for dog walking and so forth. You know, these companies had outsized valuations from the VCs, and they don't have a business model to go with it. Consider Uber's experience. The story from the company is that Uber is the Amazon of transportation, implying that the company is efficient and able to achieve network effects. Network effects are present when the addition of new users to the service enhances its value for everyone. So Airbnb has network effects. The more listings, the better it is. Facebook has network effects. But Uber is about as far from Amazon as it can be, despite the fact that a credulous press and politicians bought this line. And 2 weeks ago, I asked the question about this in a workshop in New York, and the former head of the Taxi and Limousine Commission, now the deputy mayor of New York, actually gave me this erroneous comparison, and she said, oh, but Uber is the Amazon of transportation. And the reason it's not is because network effects are minimal for in-person local transport services like transportation and delivery. The critical mass of users occurs very quickly because we're dealing with a small in-person service. We're not dealing with Facebook or Amazon, which is shipping goods all over the world. The network only needs to be very small. In reality, the model was designed to achieve something else: market dominance, or what you would know more colloquially as monopoly power. And so far, it has gotten that, to the detriment of drivers, riders, city governments, and residents. Once Uber destroyed the competition, it planned to jack up prices and make super profits. At the core of the exploitation on these platforms is the fact that these are not profitable businesses at the scale the companies are trying to achieve, fancy technology notwithstanding. You know, this is where you can see the difference with Airbnb. Airbnb just takes a reasonable fraction of every exchange. I mean, it got a little bit higher, but it's not a predator. It's you know, taking its 15% or whatever it is. Its users are happy. Its problems lie elsewhere. For the first decade of its existence, Uber and Lyft subsidized rides by 40%. So every ride that you took was subsidized by these venture capitalists at 40% in order to get people hooked onto the rides and get this very large market. Many of these apps offered unrealistically low prices to begin with to get consumers hooked. I just said that. But pricing below cost is predatory behavior and illegal if it's anti-competitive, which it was in the case of ride-hail. Uber set out to destroy what it calls taxi, with a capital T, an industry that provided thousands of jobs and an immigrant stepping stone to a better life. And they've succeeded in many places. It's almost impossible to get a taxi from where I live now. In a little-known twist to the story, Uber adopted a playbook pioneered by the Koch brothers, who had started the war on taxi some years earlier as part of their campaign to destroy all government regulation. After destroying taxi, Uber set its sights on public transport, and they have weakened it. In a rare, transparent moment, Uber named public transportation as a competitor in its IPO documents, thereby giving the lie to its pronouncements that it was not trying to compete with public transportation, and then it quickly retracted its admission. But people can also walk, cycle, not go somewhere, or drive themselves. And here, the slides were out of order. But this is a really important point to understand about ride-hail. So this was a study done by users of ride-hail, and it asked the question, if Uber or Lyft was unavailable, what transportation alternatives would you use for the trips? fewer trips. I'd walk, I'd take a bike, I'd use public transit, I'd carpool, I'd drive. What that means is that when the prices went up, these people had substitutes and they would find them. And it's a really strong piece of evidence about my basic point, which is that the market for ride hail is only viable in as a much smaller market than what Uber was trying to do. It's so-called market dominance to own transportation. Once people have to pay these high prices, which is inevitably where the industry was going, it's a very shrunken market, and that's how we get, to this, which is Uber, the insanity, I guess we can call it that, I didn't write it here, of Uber. Since the pandemic, the wheels fell off the bus, or should I say they fell off the Uber, which is that the true economics of Uber came to be understood by more. Now, there are people who've understood this all along, but here you can see the cumulative losses of Uber, $32 billion, the largest losses of any company in human history. You can see why they're squeezing the drivers, and this is the squeeze of the drivers, and sometimes it goes up even higher, Uber's share of gross payments. Because it doesn't have a business model, it has to squeeze the workers, because its basic economics just make no sense. Prices have gone up substantially, making ride hail more expensive than taxis in some cities and circumstances. The companies are pocketing more of the revenue and squeezing drivers who are also suffering from the gas price increases. Contrary to the claims of superior efficiency, ride hail is more expensive to operate than taxi. Think of all of the tech costs, the bloated corporate payrolls, the lobbyists, the law they bought for more than $200 million in California, the state to your south. Uber hired 5 people from my son's PhD class alone 2 years ago at very high salaries. Ride hail is also no longer servicing the less profitable areas that taxi didn't want to service. That was one of its big claims. And Uber has brought us an even worse product at an even higher price. And its shift into food delivery is not going to help, because food delivery has even worse economics than ride hail. Lower margins, a less profitable industry to be in. The bottom line is that the economics of these platforms don't allow for decent treatment except at a much higher price point. And that means a much smaller market than what Uber planned. So we can have ride hail, but it's going to be small like taxi was. It's not going to be there for people who just don't feel like walking 15 minutes, to the college students who don't want to walk to a bar that's 15 minutes away and they get in an Uber. Okay. A New York Times writer figured this out about a year ago, but his spot-on analysis doesn't seem to have broken through Uber's PR, which has been magnificent. If they'd gone into the PR industry, I would say they'd be a good company. And I just want to read this quote, because he really nailed it. Profits are good for investors, of course, and while it's painful to pay subsidy-free prices for our extravagances, there's also a certain justice to it. Hiring a private driver to shuttle you across Los Angeles during rush hour should cost more than $16 if everyone in that transaction is being fairly compensated. Getting someone to clean your house, do your laundry, or deliver your dinner should be a luxury if there's no exploitation involved. The fact that some high-end services are no longer easily affordable by the merely semi-affluent may seem like a worrying development, but maybe it's a sign of progress. What I didn't like about this is that he called it a millennial lifestyle subsidy, which is somewhat true, but it's not only millennials who are using these. A sensible economic system wouldn't enable these businesses. Instead, ours has thrown tens, if hundreds of billions at it. Predictably, the degradation of wages and working conditions led to changing demographics. At the beginning, gig workers were almost all college graduates. Many had graduate degrees, and while some entered because they couldn't find employment just after graduating into the Great Recession, they weren't a desperate bunch. They were also mostly white. However, as the downward trajectory intensified, the labor force changed. We don't have great national data, but it's evident in individual cities. In Los Angeles, the labor force in ride-hail grew older, more non-native, and more likely to be supporting a family. A Bay Area study just before the pandemic found that 63% of all ride-hail and delivery workers relied on these platforms for their primary source of income, and 78% were workers of color, 56% immigrants. 32% reported sometimes or often sleeping in their cars before or after performing app work. They're also much older than what we found in the early days, median age of 40. When we started out, it was mostly recent college grads. The changing workforce also put in place dynamics that intensified precarity and exploitation. Immigrants, people with dependents, and BIPOC workers are all more disadvantaged in the labor market. They have fewer good options, so they are more likely to stay rather than exit when the companies squeeze them. Willingness to stay raises one of the major findings of my research, that the gig labor force is uniquely heterogeneous, and that this helps explain the exploitation and precarity. Earlier, I noted a couple of features of gig work that are at the center of the model: the ability to choose schedules and to work as much or as little as one wants. This is a rare feature in the US labor market, indeed in most labor markets. So the conventional workplace model is that the employer controls hours and the labor process, including through technology and labor process, but employers set hours. And part of why I think I have really focused on this is, Ellen mentioned I wrote a book on working hours back in 1992, but it's been something that I've paid a lot of attention to for many years, and it's something that has really gone under the radar, I think, in a lot of ways in understanding, certainly in labor economics. So there are at least two reasons that their model makes sense for the companies, which is giving workers the ability to choose their hours. One, the services we're discussing today, driving and delivery, are an on-demand service for customers. So the companies need a flexible labor force to use surge pricing, incentives, and so forth to match supply and demand. And they're good at that. That's one of the things the algorithms do. Second, requiring fixed schedules or minimum hours of work would undermine their claim that these people are independent contractors. Instead, they use gamification and other kinds of incentives and punishments to adjust labor supply. They tout the flexibility they offer as a major attraction of this type of work. So in the platform model, the employer cedes control over hours and some aspects of the labor process and greatly reduces barriers to entry. Shop with Instacart, be your own boss, work 5 hours a month if you want. The platform's still there for you. And it is. Across most of the platforms we've studied, the ability to choose one's schedule really matters to workers. For some, it's because they have other fixed obligations like childcare or other things, or they're running a business. Some are disabled and don't know when they're going to be able to work. And the apps are a huge, this freedom is a huge advantage and boon for them. Others just like the freedom. It's part of the being your own boss that many workers really appreciate. In a world where bosses in lower paying jobs can be pretty crappy, it's important not to underestimate how much this matters to workers. While a minority of workers may do most of the work, there's tremendous diversity in hours across the labor force, and this is where that heterogeneity comes in. So this is from a ride-hail study done by Michael Reich and James Parrott. I think this was the Seattle one. So the blue is the share of drivers working these different hours. So you see a lot of diversity across here. So 20% doing less than 10 hours a week, 22% 10 to 20, etc. Now, this is the share of trips. So these long-hour drivers do a very disproportionate number of trips. But in terms of the people, which is what matters for what we're going to talk about in a minute, you see them doing all kinds of, big range across here. That's the heterogeneity I'm talking about. Let me show it to you in one of our studies. So this is Bring Your Package. This is a big box to residential package delivery platform. These are the 3 groups of workers in 2018, 19, and 20. These are California workers. I'm going to come back to them in a minute. But what you see is you've got these 3 different groups of workers. You have a full-time group, you've got a stable group, and an intermittent group. And this is just by the number of hours that they're working. And it doesn't really change that much across this time. Of course, this was a pandemic year. But what you see is that driver heterogeneity. And as I say, I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, scheduling flexibility plus the open access nature of the model means that workers' experiences are very different or heterogeneous. We found that whether or not the worker depended on the platform to pay their basic living expenses, and that was a question we asked them in all of our interviews and surveys, that had a large impact on their experiences. Supplemental workers, so here, the flexible side hustle for cash. So these are just like people who are doing a little bit of extra versus here's the full-time Uber worker on strike. What we call supplemental workers were far more satisfied, had more say over what they did, and were less controlled by the algorithm. And on some platforms, they could earn higher wages by being choosier. And what I mean by less controlled by the algorithm was they just didn't always follow the rules. The algorithm tells them to do one thing, they do another. They lie to the algorithm. They just didn't care. They don't care about the ratings, etc. Talking about a friend, one of our respondents explained the logic. Talking about his friend. He charges $45 an hour, but he doesn't care because he has another full-time income. So he's like, you want me to heavy lift for you? I don't care if you choose me or not. He has leverage. We had one guy who didn't like waiting in line, but on one of the platforms we did a lot of work on TaskRabbit, waiting in line when a new iPhone came out was a popular task that people would put on iPhone. This guy would charge $150 to wait online for an iPhone, because he didn't like to wait online. And by the way, he got people choosing him because he had a good rating. Supplemental earners are able to avoid dangerous situations, reject jobs with even a whiff of scam, that's a whole other story, and tailor their experiences to meet their needs. In contrast, dependent workers are more likely to be earning poverty wages, to be put into dangerous situations, to worry about ratings and deactivation, to feel controlled by the algorithm, and to be on the job at times when the pay is lousy. Platform work is the 21st century version of the notorious piecework system in which workers toiled long and hard for almost nothing. That's the kind of desperate, exploitative experience that many dependent workers have reported. They're often in debt for the vehicles. They lose scheduling flexibility because they have to work so much. And I'm going to tell you the story of one guy who's it's a heartbreaking story. His name was Kenrick. It's a made-up name. He had a decent job with benefits doing satellite TV installation. When Uber came around, quote, "It was the best part-time job I ever had, and I loved doing it. You know, you work your own hours, no one forces you to go out there. It was great. It didn't matter whether I made $1 or I made $200. It was part-time extra money in my pocket." His installation job was dead end, and he wanted to earn more, so he decided to do Uber full-time. Turned into a nightmare. He had to buy a new vehicle because of excessive wear and tear and maintenance. The rates fell. He developed back pain from sitting in the car too long. He was hoping for more time with his family, but found, quote, that for a driver to really make it out there, he has to work a minimum of 12 hours plus. He's working 7 days a week, needs everything he earns to pay his basic expenses, which means he hasn't been able to set anything aside for the tax bill at the end of the year. He and his wife are subletting their living room on Airbnb, and honestly, who is going to rent to stay in someone's living room in anticipation of tax day. It's scary, he says, and I am definitely wanting to get out of the business because I am going to put myself in a big hole. Actually, he already had. Now, why is this distinction between dependent and supplemental workers so important? Well, one reason is it shows, back to my earlier point, the companies are free riding on conventional employers. Gig work is really only viable as a supplemental earner with benefits, decent pay, and security from another employer. But it also means these workers are very hard to organize. Supplementals are not invested in the platform, they're shorter term, they're harder to get to put in the time and effort necessary for successful collective action. In conventional workplaces, there's more similarity of situation, and it's easier to make common cause. Heterogeneity of situation impedes the development of a collective identity, which is necessary for unionization or other kind of collective action. Add the spatial dispersion, the individualization of the whole process, and the fact that many of these workers don't know other drivers or deliverers. While there's some organizing going on, it's proving to be very difficult. A series of flash strikes on apps looked promising in 2020, but sustained labor action of the sort that we're seeing in other places, Starbucks, Amazon, it hasn't developed. There is something surprising about this, given that that the platforms shift nearly all the risk of these jobs onto the workers. In our research, we've identified many of those risks, of not earning enough to feed one's family, of being arbitrarily deactivated, of doing a job but canceling it because you're afraid and not getting paid because you're afraid you're going to get a bad rating, of having the platform hire so many workers that you can't get jobs, of being poorly treated by restaurants where you're picking up food, of being injured or even killed on the job with no compensation. Workers have talked to us about being harassed in neighborhoods where one seems not to belong based on their race or class. And that's, the companies won't give them company-branded equipment because that's another, they're worried we think it will make them seem like employees. So they're in their own cars, in their own clothing, having guns drawn on them, having dogs sicked on them. They report being physically and verbally attacked by customers, getting parking tickets, being scammed by customers, a practice that really grew during the pandemic, of being tip baited, lured to accept a job by a large tip, which is removed by the customer after the work is done. And yet, among ride-hail, shoppers, and food deliverers, we found that only 11% of workers held the companies responsible for these conditions. So we did an analysis of 70 workers in those three platforms. We developed their orientation to the risk that they had to face. We asked them, what are the risks? We classified them, and then we said, how did they think about the risks? Oppositional were the ones who thought, well, the companies should do something about it. All of these other groups either thought, well, maybe they should, but you can't beat City Hall, resign submission. Yeah, they're complying because of cost and benefit, they think it's better. These two are sort of, yeah, it's fine. We don't mind taking the risks. We should, they should go on us. Only 11%, 11% had what we call oppositional attitudes, or what in another era we might have called a working class consciousness. The large majority felt that the shift of risks onto the workers was acceptable. And this sort of illustrates what Uber scholar Katie Wells and her colleagues have identified as what she calls low expectations. US workers have been made to feel that companies owe them very little, that they're on their own, and that they should bear the risks of making a living. So let me end with a few words about what can be done. The precarity and predation associated with gig labor are not inevitable. There are solutions if we can muster enough worker and public pressure. The most straightforward path is the one taken by New York City. And I have to, in all fairness to that deputy mayor, she was running the Taxi and Limousine Commission when they put in a pretty good system. A rare but important alliance of app-based and taxi drivers, plus a democratic government and an active regulatory body, that TLC in New York. instituted a decent minimum wage. So it's going to probably go up to $30 because of inflation or more this year, and that's including expenses. Net of expenses, the original wage is $17, and that'll probably go up to about $20. And that includes idling time. So whenever they're on the app trying to get work, they get paid. The companies have not left New York City. Now, that victory was made possible by a strong union presence and also by an alliance between taxi and gig workers. That's one route. An interesting aspect of the New York City situation is that there's still independent contractors, but the city forces the government to adhere to minimum standards. A second path forward is to reclassify gig workers as employees, and this is what AB 5 did in California. One issue here is that few gig workers want to be reclassified. The work on risk I just referenced, and that's still up here, we found almost nobody who preferred to be an employee. It's complicated, or as scholar Vina Dubal has called it, it's an uber ambivalence. Many want the protections of employment, but they're worried they'll lose the flexibility. Low pay plus a boss just seems too much to bear. And but there's no reason to think the companies have to take away the flexibility and the ability of workers to set their own hours. In fact, the on-demand nature of the services suggests that the platforms need a flexible labor force, but they threaten to take away flexibility at every turn, and they are insistent that it's a trade-off between flexibility and employment. But let me go back to this graph. The reason we have these California separated out is that this company, in anticipation of AB 5, in 2020 turned its workers all into employees, all these gig workers. And they gave us our data. We've done the first study of what happens when a gig labor force goes from IC to independent, to employment. And what we found is really interesting. It can work, and there was minimal, if any, impact on flexibility. The company did not change the scheduling system at all. It's true, it was somewhat more expensive for the company, but efficiency and quality improved, and management told us that things were better. Some platforms might need to institute some partial shift system. This one had a shift system. But it's still extremely flexible, that workers can sign up whenever they want and they can cancel and so forth. And many of the delivery companies use shift systems as it is. Now, the third option, so I've talked about there's regulation, there's employment status. The third option, which we've also studied, is worker-owned platforms, or what are called platform cooperatives. And we did the first academic study of a platform cooperative. It's not in Ride-Hail, it was a photographer's co-op. Extremely successful, both financially successful and very, very happy artists. There's tremendous enthusiasm for platform co-ops, and a number of them have been formed, including in ride-hail and delivery. They've had more success in Europe, where there's a much bigger co-op sector. But while this model has a lot to recommend it, without capital or some other advantage, it's unlikely that any form, co-op or not, can compete in these already monopolized markets. It's possible that another type of advantage could come from city governments. If they were to set up platforms, they'd have a chance. But so far, no city has taken that step. But San Francisco was talking about it for delivery at one point, but nothing's happened. So in the end, I think a solution likely involves all three of these pathways: unionization, strong worker organizations, responsible regulators, and the presence of worker-owned options as a competitive check on the companies. In such a world, gig labor might just have a chance to live up to the promise of its early days. Thank you.
We welcome your questions, and Abby will bring a mic to you. Yes, for the live stream you do, Margaret. Yeah.
This is just a question about clarification. I was a little confused on the graph about California and non-California.
Yes.
So the California is the non-lined, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you had described it, I think, as
Oh,
opposite.
I
So-
had it backwards, I'm sorry.
So, well, actually, what it shows, I think, is that hours increased when they moved to an employment model,
So.
an employee model.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's what the models show. There's some increase in hours, but not for all the groups, not for the full-timers, interestingly. So there is some increase in hours, which is what I predicted, because the companies would want them to work longer hours, but it's actually not that large, the increase in hours. But yes, there is some increase in hours, and there's an increase in efficiency, meaning the ratio of scheduled hours to hours to work actually done also improved. Yeah. But my point here, I may have misspoken. My point here was to say that you have still all three. You've got all three groups. They don't just all force them all into full-time status. In fact, they didn't force anybody into any status, and we're not even sure why the hours went up, whether it was pressure from the companies or that just the workers wanted to do more.
Thanks for your talk. I'm curious what you think could facilitate the expansion of worker ownership, and given that you described a lot of the risks associated with a lot of these platforms, would that, like, what are the barriers and how do we, like, move past them for worker ownership? What seems like it has a lot of barrier to entry or to make that happen and organized.
Yeah. So.
Can you speak in the podium mic, please?
Oh, is this one not working? Okay, so, I can tell you what I think, but it's not, it's not based on any rigorous research about it. Well, I mean, we do know historically from research that access to capital is really key for cooperatives. Until a couple of years ago, there were only 250 worker cooperatives in this country. And there are now maybe the last number I heard was 400, maybe there are 500 at this point. So it's been really, really difficult. Stocksy, the company, the cooperative we studied, had a couple of things going for it. Number one, it was turned into cooperative by owners of that company. And this is one of the ways that you see successful cooperatives. They're sort of built by someone, and then they turn it over to the, Bob's Red Mill, they turn it over to the employees. So this was a platform that they built a stock photography platform. They'd been very successful. They sold out to Getty, who's the Amazon of stock photography. They took 1.3 million, not that much money, that they'd gotten when they sold out to Getty, everybody hated being at Getty. And so they said, let's do a co-op. They gave that loan to the co-op, which paid it back pretty quickly. So they had money. They had a good market niche. They sort of went up market a little bit with their brand. But the other thing they had was a lot of experience and skill in what they were doing. Now, you have that, I think, with the driver co-ops, because many of the driver co-ops are started by people who have been driving for a long period of time, and so they have that. But right now, the big issue is how do you get people off Uber and Lyft and onto these apps. I thought it might be a little bit easier in the case where, because workers can be on the co-op app as well as the other apps at the same time. But I don't think in the US, I don't think any of these are really scaling yet. So I think money for marketing and advertising is really key. capital is the biggest barrier. It has historically been the biggest barrier to worker co-ops, according to the research that I've seen.
Thank you for your wonderful lectures. I just want to share some of my experience as a share rider driver, and also I rent one of my living room for Airbnb, and very interesting to hear all those comparison. My personally feeling is the Airbnb. I'm just wondering, did you study how the companies run their business in certain of the model? Because Airbnb only charge like 3% from the host and the most service fee, which is very reasonable from the guest. And so I don't lose so much money. But if I drive for Lyft, and almost my half of the payment from the guest goes to the company. And so obviously they're so different business model. So I don't know, is there any possible way, I don't know, in the future to regulate the share market? Because I just don't feel Lyft, they're charging the reasonable fee from the driver. We really squeezing our payments. So I would like to hear from your study about those different business model, or why they are different in such a different in this way.
So yes, and that was the point the point about Airbnb that I was making, which is that it has a reasonable business model. It's just taking something close to the value that it's actually contributing to the process. Could a ride-hail platform do that? Maybe, but part of it has to do with the fact that the margins are much smaller in ride-hail and in food delivery than they are in accommodations. And the other thing to think about is that in accommodations, basically people are earning money on their capital as well as their labor. There's some labor involved in being an Airbnb host, but a lot of the payment is to the capital. So if you think about the amount of money you get for the work that you do as a host is very large compared to spending that much time in driving and delivery. And again, I think it has more to do with the market power of the market power of the companies. And you see, it's easy for hosts and guests to go off platform, easier in the accommodations sphere. So for example, if I come and stay at your Airbnb and I pay, and Airbnb wants to charge a large sum, the next time I come back, I contact you privately because I know I can trust you now, and we just cut Airbnb out altogether. This is one of the mistakes that TaskRabbit made. They had a change in their model, and they started charging 35%, which is closer to an Uber-style commission, to first-time users, and a lot of people just started going off platform. So they don't have as much ability to squeeze the hosts and guests as the driving platforms do.
Thanks for a really interesting talk. Your examples were about people really making, I guess, incorrect calculations about what they could make as a laborer on these platforms. You had the person who figured out they were making $6.25 an hour, and then you had the person who just changed and suddenly they couldn't make ends meet. And then you talked about this software firm, I guess, right? So yeah. It does seem like at the end, that seems like a fourth solution, is that if people really, these are really difficult calculations to figure out, what, at the end of the day, you buy your own car, your own insurance, all this other stuff, whether it'll be better for you than in your current situation. And it does seem like if people were actually had that calculation ready at hand, you could see collapse of the supply of drivers for Uber, and it could really matter and really obviously erode their kind of monopoly power over labor. So.
Well, it's interesting because, of course, a standard economic model would suggest the kind of dynamics that you just articulated so well. What I think that, and there are apps that are out there that help people track their expenses and so forth, and some of these people are pretty good at it. You know, so I gave you some examples of people who are, you know, a little more on the clueless side. So, but there are a couple of things that I think are relevant here. One of the things is that with the supplemental earners, people have a very low value for their free time, many of them. So we had like MIT graduates who worked in labs who tell us that they were, you know, earning on these errands platforms because otherwise they're bored. And they want to be productive all the time, and they're going in there cleaning people's houses. You know, it's a kind of, well, that's interesting. But their time outside of work is not as so valuable to them. On the other hand, for the more dedicated workers, the hours matter because those are hours that they've got to earn on, whereas for the others they don't. So you've got that kind of discontinuity in the labor force. And I think the other thing is that even if they figure it out, you've got some of these people who just don't have alternatives. And that's where the labor force has really changed over time to a group of people who are more desperate and without choices. And of course, the standard labor market model in economics assumes that people have plenty of choices and they'll move out. But I think you're right that the more information people have, the better they will be able to challenge the companies, and you may see more exit. The one thing I'd say to it, though, that's interesting is a lot of them are on these forums that we studied, and the forum has lots of information. And what's going on is that it's also, I mean, this is where you need a behavioral economics explanation for what's going on, because there's the difference between the current moment, and there's a lot of discounting of the future, of like thinking about the taxes that you're going to have to pay or the new car that you're going to have to pay in the future, where people they're focusing on the current economics, and they get into trouble in part because of that. And a lot of these people understand they're making less than minimum wage, but it's also true that those non-pecuniary benefits that I talked about really matter to a lot of these people. They don't want a boss, they like to drive, and so we have a world in which the society is allowing people to be exploited for that. They're not even getting a basic minimum wage. So that seems like, at the very least, that's a first step, that these companies should not be allowed to do that. And then we can debate about how much less money should somebody get for the value of not having a boss or whatever. I don't know who's first. I'll go.
Okay, so I recently went to a wedding, and this has to do with Uber in St. Louis, and my sister was there, and she forced me to learn to use Uber, and I took about 20 trips in 4 days, and I have to say it was great. It was so far superior to the taxi that I would never take the taxi again unless I had to. It's also cheaper, and the morale of the drivers seemed much better than taxi drivers. And so, but my question is, as you say, this is being subsidized by Uber, and they're throwing away billions and billions of dollars on this. And so, why do they keep doing that? And how long are they going to do this? And maybe the taxis are going to come back when Uber, gets tired of losing money. Is that a possibility?
Absolutely. So you do see in some of the more competitive markets like Chicago, there's been some analysis of how actually taxis are cheaper than Uber, and so that'll increase their market share. I don't know how much longer Uber is going to be doing it. It has to do with that PR point I made, which is a lot of people thought after the IPO that was going to be it, that the shareholders were not going to have the same kind of attitude that the VCs had, and they were going to demand profits sooner and so forth. And they're inching closer to, breaking even. But part of the problem is they use these, I took this part of the talk out because it's a little bit, just was in the weeds too much, but they use these kind of unusual, they're not unusual, but they use these accounting practices that are very opaque, and they're not the standard profit and loss kinds of calculations. So it's really hard for most people to know actually what's happening with Uber, and they keep promising profits. It's been going on for years. Oh, we're just on the verge of profitability. We're just on the verge of profitability. I've never understood your view about the taxis. I think it varies a lot by place. Like, I'm in New York City a lot. Taxis, I much prefer taxi to an Uber. You just you put your hand out, there's a taxi, they're great.
That's New York.
That's New York. Yeah, I know. There are places, and of course the origin story of Uber was about how horrible the taxis were in San Francisco. They're not bad where I live in Boston, very expensive, although now they're pretty much at parity now for airport runs and so forth. So I don't know the answer to your question. I do know that many consumers, I didn't talk at all about consumers, we did interview consumers also. Many consumers love Uber. And you're right, many of the drivers also like it, and the fact is we've got, the supplementals especially, but one of the reasons they're there is the people who like to talk and they like to drive, and that it works out for them. So we'll see what happens. I don't see a future with low prices. I see a future with high prices and a smaller market, but that may be fine for plenty of consumers, who are willing to pay a price that actually, is a fair price and not a predatory one.
Hi, thank you for such a wonderful talk. I'm curious if you asked any of the workers or if you have any data on how they choose which companies to work for. So I know a lot of drivers do Uber and Lyft, and there's obviously differences between delivering food and delivering people. But I wonder if the company, if it's money or if it's the company's status or how other people see them as being an Uber driver versus a Lyft driver. Yeah.
So my sense of the last question is that doesn't come into it at all, that what we think is happening, which we saw much more in my second project, is the apps are really becoming easy substitutes for each other, and more workers are not just doing Uber versus Lyft, which was always there, but Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Uber Eats, and Uber actually has multiple. It has the ride hail and the Uber Eats on the same app, so they can switch. For some, it's all about cost or earnings. So they're figuring out across these apps which are the better ones. For some people, it's also things like liking to talk to people. So the food delivery has almost no human interaction. We have a lot more women on Instacart because they like to go grocery shopping, whereas you've got people for whom going to a grocery store is horrible and they don't want to be doing that. So there doesn't seem to be much rhyme or reason or, sort of a clear pattern. I think personal preferences matter. People will move about times of day because there's different demand at different times of day. The food delivery is peaks and valleys. There's the lunchtime, there's the evening, and then there's that late evening thing. The ride hail, it's on the rush hours, and there's not much in the middle of the day, So I would say money is the biggest thing that moves them around, but then there's also a little bit of this personal preference.
I have a real basic question, which is this economy even sustainable? especially when you start looking at the for-profit large companies like Uber. I'm just looking at Uber's, like their stock value is $51 billion. And it seems unlikely that maybe the whole market they're trying to take over is worth that much. And so is this even sustainable for a long period of time? I mean, especially when you do have these sort of valuations that make absolutely no sense when they're losing more money than is, ever been lost in history. I mean, it kind of almost seems like a WeWork or an Enron. It's kind of like, it's fantasy money. And that's what's going on. I mean, so is this, you mentioned some of these that are doing well, but it doesn't seem like most of them are doing that. And the drop in stock prices for those companies is astounding. I mean, so is it sustainable?
So the argument that I've, was making is that it's not, that many of these platforms have a business model that can only work for a much smaller market with much higher prices. So that can be sustainable. So yes, we can have a ride-hail market in this country, but it's going to be far fewer drivers and far fewer passengers, and they're going to pay more, and it's going to look more like what taxi was in terms of size. So that was why I showed you the graph. People can walk, they can stay home, they can do all these things, and when the prices get high, that's what they're going to do. Airbnb is very sustainable. The online digital freelancer markets are sustainable. The Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is the really low end where you get paid pennies for human intelligence jobs and so forth, is sustainable because it's a global market and they have a huge number of people who are willing to work for these pennies, and the technology makes it very possible. The local in-person services, which is what I have focused on in my research, those are the ones that I think those big growth, that idea that these are going to be big industries is not. So we can go back to that New York Times quote, because I think that's really nails it in certain ways. And what I argued in the book was this is like, I called it slices of servants or something. What these platforms did was they basically created servants for ordinary people, not just for rich people who could always afford servants, but it's a slice of a servant. It's an hour of a servant's time or a half hour of a servant's time. And that, I think, is not sustainable in a world where the middle class just doesn't have that much money or really will want to spend it when those services get priced at their true cost. And that's maybe the bottom line of part of what I was saying. And it's, I think, a big part of the explanation for why these platforms have gotten so exploitative.
My impression is that Airbnb and Vrbo and some of those types of sharing economies aren't really sharing so much anymore, that corporations have bought up just whole bunches of beach homes and whole sets of apartments in New York City. I know New York City has tried to stop some of that from going on. And then you're talking about a workforce of cleaning people, basically, and I didn't hear you talk about those people. Or is that a full-time job? Is that a temporary? Or are they just hiring people for a few hours to clean every week? Or what's going on there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I should have added a few slides at the end thinking this one might come up. So we've done some work on what we call commercialization on Airbnb, which definitely speaks to the point that you've made, which is the movement of properties into basically full-time rentals. And we've looked at the what's happened in cities where what are called long-term rentals, so just regular rental properties, are taken off the market and turned into these short-term rentals. And that has created shortages of rental properties, and it's created big increases in rents as well because of the shortages. And it's called the rent gap, and we've analyzed it across the country. And we've shown the growth in these highly commercialized listings. Yes, the cities are trying to crack down on them, and some of them have been more successful. New York, San Francisco's tried to track down on them, et cetera. And they're not, they're not legal in most places. But Airbnb has been, they have fought tooth and nail over the years to really crack down on them. They'll have a crackdown and everybody will come back on. And also, to some extent, to be a little fairer to the company, it's hard for them to figure, it's Airbnb is not they don't own them, it's these illegal operators, ghost hotels they're often called, and so forth. I haven't seen any work on the people who are cleaning the apartments. It's a really good question. Probably a hard labor force to find, but to the extent that these are more commercialized, I would guess these are going to be commercial cleaning services that are exploiting people, where it's somebody who has one apartment or so forth, they may have a one-to-one relationship, but where you're talking the bigger companies, and we did find a lot of those on the listings.
Oh, I get the last one. Thank you so much. Wonderful, wonderful. Popular economics at its best. Thank you so much. Yeah, just the last point you raised isn't where my questions was going, but my son has a friend who has developed an app actually he has several Airbnb properties in Hawaii, and he's actually professionally an app developer, computer scientist, but he developed an app for organizing the people who do the cleaning. And so they are cycled into this through an app, and so it's kind of an interesting take on this. But my question was kind of back to the big capital behind this, the venture capital, and in the strategy of getting to that point, that touch-off point for a public offering, where of course their gains come in, right? And so where does venture capital go after that for these variety of investments in the gig sector? Where does it go after it's said goodbye to after the IPO, after?
I don't know. I guess it just goes on to the next thing. I mean, a lot of these apps there are some people who have specialized in these, so they probably go on to whatever the new, the app that your son's friend is. But most of the investors are not particularly specialized to this kind of investment, so they'll go into others. One other thing I want to say that's really important, I haven't talked at all about the politics of this and why Uber got so powerful so quickly. And it's a point that I don't remember if I talked about it in the book, but it's really been missed, which is that investors in Uber were some of the most powerful companies in the country. Goldman Sachs, Google, I can't, I don't want to say anymore. Those are the two that come to mind, but many others of a similar ilk. So when they were up against these city regulators, you can imagine, how much clout they had, not just from their own PR, which was prominent and so forth, and we have some research on that, but also just the clout that is really behind them. So these companies, they're investing in all kinds of things. I don't know, we'd have to take a ride down Route 5 or 101 and, find out what the latest things are. The last thing I'll say on the VCs is one of the things I witnessed early on was one of the leading investors in the quote-unquote sharing economy, big Uber investor and others, at a conference, the sort of coming out conference of the sharing economy, and this guy got up there and he just talked about sharing and how wonderful this all was, and it sounded just like Devin, who I started my talk with, about how it's a new economic model and a way we're going back to the past and we're all going to live in a little village and be nice to each other. And you know, I suppose on some level he believed it. And it just shows how diluted and how powerful that idealist discourse was. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.